Pod racing was a popular sport in the less developed regions of the galaxy, and it was one of the most dangerous sports ever invented. Racers losing their lives during competitions was commonplace. Pod racers were small, one-man repulsor craft, composed of an anti-gravity pod propelled by one or more pairs of large turbine engines. The engines were not physically connected to each other, being linked instead by power couplings consisting of plasma discharges. The engines were connected to the pods themselves by means of long, steel-tongue cables. Pod racers were custom-built and were only as safe as the mechanic and the pilot that made them. Besides housing the racer's pilot, each pod contained a repulsor lift engine that kept the craft at a specific low-level altitude. The turbine engines were incredibly powerful and were connected by an energy binder that kept them from flying apart. Pod racing was popularized in the Outer Rim territories during the last decades of the Galactic Republic. Its underground nature, great excitement, and almost gladiatorial propensity for carnage held immense appeal to all manner of folk living on the fringes of society. Because of the reflexes needed to control the pod as it raced around the course at breakneck speeds, as well as the dexterity needed to control the pod racer, human pod racers were uncommon on Tatooine by 32 BBY, apart from Anakin Skywalker, being dominated by non-humans. Inhuman physical attributes as well as extra pairs of hands came in handy when trying to control the pod at its top speeds of around 900 kilometers per hour. While the first race and racers are lost to history, pod racing traced its roots back to the days of animal-drawn carts on many different worlds. On Tatooine, these kart races evolved to incorporate Hano speeders. These events were held by Boonta the Hutt himself after his victory over the Parliament of Morillon, and continued after his death. Developing across the Outer Rim and developing at a pace with that of galactic technology, various sports were reported to exist at multiple times in the history of the Galactic Republic, with Sectra Arms being recognized as having produced some of the first engines for an early version of the sport. The concept of modern-day pod racing was born circa 100 BBY on Malastare by alien racer Gustav Wenbus. Wenbus had entered himself in a race with a super-fast prototype pod designed by a mechanic named Phobos. Standardizing the pod racer's configuration and promoting the first circuits, Wenbus's rules were simple. Build a racer, make it fast, and race. Prizes usually consisted of parts or credits, and were awarded to the first to cross the finish line or the last surviving racer. One of the most famous pod races was the Boonta Eve Classic, held on Tatooine in 32 BBY. The spectacular race was especially notable for being won by a human, 9-year-old Anakin Skywalker. Other popular races at the time included the Vinta Harvest Classic on Malastare, the Ando Overland on Ando Prime, and the Alien Classic. Although technically illegal, but often controlled by the Hutts, pod racing flourished during the rule of the Galactic Republic, particularly among planets in the Outer Rim and on worlds such as Malastare and Ando Prime. With hundreds of thousands of circuits in operation on just as many worlds, pod racer pilots were often venerated athletes and were known for their swaggering, cocky demeanor. The sport was also watched by citizens from the core worlds. Large view screens and seedy establishments, such as the Outlander Club on Coruscant, relayed pod races from all across the galaxy. Pod racing's popularity reached an all-time high following Skywalker's win, but as the political situation in the Republic deteriorated, so did the appeal of pod racing. Many of the sport's generally accepted criminal activities were exposed, and some of the most famous racers were arrested for a variety of crimes. Pod racing was soon outlawed in the core. Shortly before the outbreak of the Clone Wars, it was reported that attendance had dropped more than 50% from the era of the Battle in Naboo, although betting transactions remained at an all-time high. Pod racing soon gave way to swoop racing and other forms of extreme sports. With the declaration of a new order and the rise of the Galactic Empire, pod racing became outlawed across the galaxy, and under the Empire's far more stringent standards of law enforcement, the sport fell out of popularity altogether. The sponsorships, acclaim, and cash flow that venues and racers received was brought to an abrupt end, and due to its largely non-human appeal, racers disappeared or were arrested at staggering rates. Imperial agents seized and auctioned off pod racers, the arenas, and all equipment they could locate, and within a few years of the Empire's rise, pod racing was effectively ended. Despite the Empire's best efforts, not all of the sports racers or fans were destroyed. Racers that survived the initial purge were went underground, and the popularity of the sport was rekindled, spreading to the fringes of the Outer Rim and creeping into the unknown territories. Races popped up overnight and vanished just as quickly, avoiding Imperial intervention. During one race of the Boone's Eve Classic in 1 BBY, a Star Tours owned Star Speeder 1000 inadvertently got entangled in the race due to having recently escaped from being caught by the Empire at the Star Tours space station for having a rebel spy on board. It then briefly rode alongside the racers before flying back out of the planet's atmosphere and making contact with the Alliance High Command for their next destination. Broadcast in some entertainment venues like the Vapor Room, a bar in Cloud City on Bespin and 2 BBY, the fans of pod racing found ways to circumvent Imperial law. The racers themselves became even more cocky, seemingly invincible after repeatedly evading Imperial agents. New teams developed in the wake of the crackdown and continued to thrive throughout the Galactic War. Make sure to like, subscribe, follow me on social media, and comment down below what content you'd like to see in the future. As always, thank you all for watching, and remember,
the Force will be with you, always.